You thought tonight would be the moment you finally stepped out of the shadows. Your night. The hall glowed with chandeliers, gowns swayed across the polished floor, and every face turned toward you, radiant with admiration. For once, you felt like Elena Carter, not just the daughter overshadowed by Isabel, not just the girl pressed beneath impossible expectations. But then, you noticed it. Your father's hand lingered near your glass, a movement too rehearsed to be accidental. His smile was soft, but it carried an edge you knew all too well. Your chest tightened, your pulse quickened. This wasn't a toast to honor you. It was a stage, a trap. And in that instant, your family revenge story began. If this moment grips you, gently like and subscribe, so you won't miss the next turn in this journey. From the moment you saw his hand near your glass, memories flooded back like ghosts refusing to stay buried. That single gesture carried the weight of years of silence, of sacrifice, of trying to be enough. Tonight wasn't just an accident. Tonight was the outcome of a story that began long before the lights of this hall ever touched your skin. Growing up as Elena Carter meant living in a house where beauty and perfection were demanded, not earned. Your father expected every detail to be polished. Your posture at the table, the grades you brought home, the tone of your voice when you spoke. Even your laughter was judged. Too loud, close quote, he would say. A lady should be graceful. Isabel, your younger sister, lived in a different reality. To her, your father was tender, indulgent. Where he corrected you with sharp eyes and cold silence, he caressed her cheek and told her she was special. She danced freely through the house, while you moved carefully, always aware of the invisible walls closing in around you. Your mother's absence only deepened the divide. She left when you were too young to understand why, vanishing into the night with no explanation. You were left with your father's rigid rules and his relentless pursuit of control. He told you that independence was dangerous, that emotions were weakness, and that obedience was survival. You learned to swallow your tears until they burned in your throat. Nights were spent beneath the dim glow of a desk lamp, pen scratching against paper, long after the world outside had gone to sleep. Awards and trophies piled up, but they were never enough. Good close quote, he would say, his eyes scanning your report card. But you can do better. And so you did. You pushed harder, studied longer, smiled less. Each success felt like armor, thin and fragile, but armor nonetheless. You told yourself that if you could be flawless, he might finally look at you with pride. But pride never came. Instead, he nurtured Isabel's charm, her light-hearted spirit, her effortless way of winning affection. She's such a natural, close quote, he would say in front of guests, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder. You stood beside them, invisible despite the medals that hung heavy around your neck. The message was clear. Isabel was the adored child. You were the soldier. And still, you tried. You carried the weight of expectations so heavy that your shoulders ached, believing that love was just one achievement away. But deep inside, you knew the truth. His approval was never meant to be given. It was meant to control you. The signs of betrayal began years ago. Relatives looked at you with a mix of pity and doubt, murmuring behind your back. Your father slipped questions into casual conversations, his voice low, his eyes calculating. Do you ever feel tired, Elena? Do you find it hard to keep track of things? Close quote, they sounded like concern, but they weren't. They were notes, records, evidence. One afternoon, you stumbled upon his study. Papers were stacked neatly, your name typed in bold across folder after folder. You didn't read much, only a few words before slamming the drawer shut. Capacity evaluation, guardianship, trust fund oversight. The phrases chilled you. At the time, you told yourself you were imagining things. But as his hand hovered near your glass tonight, you knew. It wasn't imagination. It was preparation. Suddenly, your past aligned like pieces of a cruel puzzle. The pressure, the constant comparison, the whispers, it wasn't random. He was building a case, crafting a narrative where you would always be the fragile one, the unstable one, the daughter unfit to stand on her own. And tonight, under the bright lights and watchful eyes of every guest, he was ready to reveal it. The toast, the smiles, the carefully chosen words, they weren't celebration. They were performance. You weren't being honored. You were being framed. But something inside you shifted. For years, you bowed under his gaze, silenced your voice, sacrificed your joy. But now, as you stood there in your gown, glass in hand, you felt something else rising. Resolve. You weren't the same girl who once cried quietly in her room, desperate for approval. You weren't the same child who lived in the shadow of Isabel's laughter. Tonight, you were more than the product of his control. You were the spark he never saw coming. And as his eyes gleamed with triumph, certain that he still held every string, you realized the truth. He had mistaken endurance for weakness. He had mistaken patience for submission. But tonight, Elena Carter would show him the difference. If you've ever carried the crushing weight of comparison, if you've ever stood where silence was expected, but strength rose instead, this story will speak to you. Gently like and subscribe, not because you have to, but so you'll be here when the truth continues to unfold. The hall still glowed with chandeliers, but the air had shifted. Applause faded into background noise as you stood frozen, glass in hand, watching your father move through the crowd like a conductor guiding his orchestra. Every step, every smile, every pause was part of a script only he seemed to know. You had seen him perform before at family gatherings, at public events, in the way he charmed guests into believing he was a man of dignity. But tonight was different. Tonight, you weren't a spectator. You were the target. His toast echoed in your mind. Brilliant, yes, but brilliance sometimes comes at a cost. The words lingered in the air, coated in charm but laced with poison. Guests nodded thoughtfully, some with pity, some with quiet judgment. It was subtle, almost invisible, but to you it was deafening. He wasn't praising you, he was branding you. Then came the look. His eyes flicked toward you as if daring you to drink, as if he could already see you faltering in front of them all. And that's when you noticed Isabel, her smile unguarded, her trust complete. She stood only a step away, holding her glass without hesitation. The decision came in a heartbeat. Your fingers tightened. With a swift, nearly invisible motion, you switched the glasses. No one noticed, not even Isabel. She raised it to her lips with a radiant smile, while your father's gaze lingered on you, convinced the next act of his performance would unfold exactly as he planned. For a moment, your chest burned with guilt. Isabel wasn't the architect of this betrayal, she was another piece of his game. But survival leaves no space for hesitation. When Isabel's laughter faltered, you knew the performance had cracked. At first, she brushed it off, a hand to her stomach, a slight shake of her head. The music carried on, and the hall filled with cheer. But slowly, the whispers began. Guests noticed her face pale, her hands tremble. A woman nearby reached to steady her, her voice sharp with concern. Your father reacted instantly, too instantly. He rushed to her side, his voice filled with stage concern, but his movements betrayed him. His hands trembled. His smile strained. He spoke quickly, too quickly. It's nothing, just nerves, the excitement of the evening. But doubt crept into the room like smoke through cracks in the floor. Relatives exchanged uneasy glances. The charm that had always cloaked him began to slip. And then, like the toll of a bell, came a voice from the crowd. Didn't you touch her glass earlier? Close quote. Silence fell. Every eye turned to him. Your father froze, just for a second, but long enough. You saw it, the flicker of panic, the calculation scrambling behind his eyes. He tried to laugh it off, to brush away the question, but the silence stretched too long. Suspicion had been planted, and it was spreading fast. You didn't speak. You didn't need to. For once, you weren't the one on trial. He was. Isabel was held to a chair, her smile gone, her trust shaken. The guests, unsettled, pressed your father with questions. His answers grew defensive, his tone sharper. The harder he tried to control the story, the more it slipped from his grasp. And in that moment, something inside you shifted again. For years, he had turned suspicion against you, weaving whispers into narratives that painted you as fragile, unstable, unfit. Tonight, his own web had caught him. You slipped away from the hall, your steps quick but quiet, your heart pounding like a drum. You knew where to go. His study had always been the place where secrets lived, tucked behind locked drawers and neatly stacked files. And when you opened them, your suspicions were confirmed. Documents. So many documents. Your name stamped in bold across page after page. Assessments from professionals whose signatures you barely recognized. Words that cut like blades. Capacity evaluation, close quote, emotional instability, close quote, unfit to manage responsibilities. Every page was a weapon, carefully crafted, waiting for the moment he could reveal it. He hadn't just planned to undermine you. He had planned to erase you. As you gathered the papers, your hands trembled not with fear, but with fury. Fury at the years of silence, the stolen childhood, the endless comparisons to Isabel. Fury at the way he smiled at you tonight as though you were already defeated. But you weren't defeated. Not anymore. When you returned to the hall, the celebration had collapsed into chaos. Isabel sat pale and shaken, guests surrounded her in concern, and your father stood alone, his mask slipping further with every question he failed to answer. His empire of control was crumbling, not with an explosion, but with cracks too deep to repair. And for the first time, you felt it, the power shift. The man who once held every string was unraveling. And you, the daughter he tried to silence, held the truth in your hands. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal, if you've ever stood in the shadow of someone who tried to rewrite your story, then you know the weight of this moment. Let it remind you that strength sometimes rises not in silence, but in the choice to stand tall. If this journey resonates with you, gently like and subscribe, so you'll be here when the next chapter of truth unfolds. The study smelled of leather and dust, as though the air itself carried secrets. Pages crackled beneath your fingers as you rifled through the neatly stacked documents. Each sheet was a blade, your name printed in bold, words twisted into accusations. Fragile, unfit, unstable. He hadn't just written your story. He had rewritten it, line by line, until you barely recognized yourself. You pressed the files against your chest, their weight pressing into your ribs like armor. For years, these papers were meant to silence you. Tonight, they were proof. When you stepped back into the hall, the air was thick, heavy, suffocating. Guests had gathered in small clusters, whispering, their glances sharp as daggers. Isabel sat hunched, pale, confusion shadowing her features. Her laughter, once so effortless, had dissolved into silence. And there he was, your father. Still standing, still performing, but the cracks showed. His tie hung loose, his smile strained, his hands restless at his sides. The man who once commanded rooms with a glance now stumbled over his own words, trying desperately to reclaim control. But the room was no longer his. Questions hit him like stones. Why was your hand on her glass? Close quote, what's happening to Isabel? Close quote, his answers faltered, his tone growing defensive. The charm that once cloaked him had evaporated, leaving only raw nerves and unraveling lies. You didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, you let the silence do its work. Isabel's eyes lifted to yours. There was no rivalry in them now, no echo of your father's favoritism. Only fear and something else. Recognition. For the first time, she saw the weight you had carried, the shadow you had lived under, the truth you had tried to survive. The hall shifted as if the building itself held its breath. And then came the words that shattered the last of his armor. A relative's voice cut through the murmur. If it wasn't Elena's glass, then whose was it? Close quote, silence fell like thunder. All eyes turned. Your father's lips parted, but no words came. His mask cracked completely, the fury in his eyes betraying what his tongue couldn't hide. He looked at you then, and for the first time, he wasn't the man in control. He was the man exposed. Your fingers tightened around the documents. The proof burned against your skin, demanding to be revealed. But not yet. Timing was everything. Tonight wasn't about destruction, it was about unveiling. The whispers grew into waves. Doubt spread like fire through dry grass. Guests who once admired him now looked with suspicion, even fear. He tried to steady himself, raising his voice above the noise, insisting it was all misunderstanding, that Isabel was simply overwhelmed. But the louder he grew, the less they believed. And in the corner of the hall, you stood silently, holding the evidence that could end him. Later that night, when Isabel was escorted to the hospital, the chaos didn't fade, it followed. Guests lingered, uneasy, their conversations sharp with suspicion. You moved quietly among them, your documents hidden but safe. You didn't need to show them yet. The damage was already spreading. Your father approached you at last, his steps heavy, his eyes burning with rage held just beneath the surface. He leaned close enough that only you could hear. You don't know what you are doing, close quote, he hissed. But you did. You had never known more clearly. For years, you had been his marionette, every movement controlled, every word judged, every step monitored. But tonight, the string snapped. He couldn't see it yet, but you could. The balance had shifted. The climax wasn't just his unraveling, it was your awakening. You left the hall in silence, the night air cold against your skin. Above, the stars shimmered, distant and untouchable, but you felt closer to them than ever before. For the first time, you weren't defined by his gaze or by the weight of his expectations. You were defined by the choice you had made, the choice to survive, to resist, to rise. Back in the quiet of your room, you spread the documents across the desk. Page after page, his betrayal unfolded. Signatures, assessments, whispered lies disguised as professional opinions. Each paper was another piece of the trap he had set, a trap designed to strip you of everything, your freedom, your identity, your future. But looking at them now, you didn't see defeat. You saw power. You saw the story he tried to write, and you saw the truth hidden between the lines. Tomorrow, these pages would no longer belong to him. Tomorrow, they would belong to you. And when the world saw them, when Isabel spoke, when the whispers from tonight turned into questions too loud to silence, he would fall. The climax of his story was here, and it was no longer his to control. The house was silent when you returned the next morning, but it wasn't the calm silence of peace. It was the kind that pressed against your chest, thick and heavy, a silence that carried the weight of things broken and unfinished. The papers you had gathered from his study still lay across your desk, their edges curling under the lamplight. You hadn't slept. Sleep felt impossible when every word on those pages echoed louder than dreams. Downstairs, you heard him pacing. His footsteps, once steady and commanding, now dragged unevenly across the floorboards. For the first time, they sounded human, uncertain, desperate. You descended slowly, each step careful, the documents pressed against your side. When you entered the room, he looked up. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes, the sharpness of his features dulled by exhaustion. Yet his gaze still carried the same fire, the same determination to dominate. Elena, close quote, he began, his voice low but unsteady. You don't understand what you're holding. Those papers are the truth, close quote, you interrupted. His jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. That silence was admission enough. For a moment, the two of you stood there, father and daughter, enemies bound by blood. The man who once dictated your every move now found himself at the mercy of your resolve. He tried to soften his tone, to slip back into the mask he had worn for years. I did this for you, close quote, he said. You've always been too fragile, too burdened. I had to protect you from yourself, from the world. But the words rang hollow. Protect you? By stripping away your freedom. By staging your collapse in front of everyone you knew. You saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't protection. It was possession. You weren't protecting me, close quote, you whispered. You were raising me. The air between you vibrated with tension. He opened his mouth, but no words came. And in that silence, you realized something. He had no defense left. His empire of control had crumbled, not with an explosion, but with the quiet certainty of exposure. The days that followed confirmed it. Guests from the party began to talk. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into suspicions too heavy to ignore. Isabel, still pale but recovering, found her voice. She approached you quietly, her hands trembling, her eyes brimming with questions. Elena, close quote, she whispered, what happened that night? Close quote, you hesitated. She was still your sister, still innocent in ways you had never been allowed to be. But she deserved the truth. Slowly, you laid out the story, the documents, the whispers, the trap disguised as a toast. At first, disbelief clouded her face. But as the details fell into place, her expression shifted. Shock, pain, and finally, recognition. I thought, she began, her voice breaking. I thought he loved me. He did, close quote, you said gently. Just not in the way we needed him to. From that day, Isabel changed. She no longer looked at your father with blind devotion. She began to notice the cracks, the manipulations, the way his words twisted into chains. For the first time, she stood beside you, not against you. Together, you brought the documents forward. Trusted hands read them, studied them, uncovered the lies hidden in their careful phrasing. The professionals who had signed them faltered under scrutiny, their complicity exposed. Without the cooperation, your father's case dissolved into dust. He fought, of course. He argued, threatened, tried to twist the narrative back in his favor. But each attempt only deepened his downfall. His reputation, once unshakable, fractured. Friends distanced themselves, relatives whispered his name with pity instead of praise. The man who once commanded every room now found himself standing alone. The final confrontation came one evening in his study, the same place where you had uncovered his lies. He sat slumped in his chair, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. You stood across from him, taller somehow, not in body but in spirit. You could have had a family, close quote, you said quietly. You could have had daughters who loved you. But you chose control. And now you have nothing. His eyes flickered with something, regret, perhaps, or maybe just the hollow echo of defeat. He didn't answer. He couldn't. You left him there, surrounded not by power, but by the silence of his own making. In the weeks that followed, life began to mend. The trust fund he once sought to control was secured in your name, not as a prize, but as a symbol that his grasp had failed. Isabel grew stronger, her laughter returning slowly, but this time without the shadow of favoritism hanging over her. Together, you began to rebuild not as rivals, but as sisters. The community shifted as well. Where once your father's name commanded respect, it now carried caution. His downfall became a story whispered at gatherings, a reminder of how power, when wielded without love, corrodes everything it touches. And you, at last, felt something you hadn't in years. Peace. Not the fragile peace of silence, but the steady peace of freedom. Each morning, you woke without the weight of his expectations pressing against your chest. Each decision was yours, each step your own. The revenge was never about destroying him. It was about reclaiming yourself. And in that reclamation, you discovered something greater. The resilience to rise, the strength to endure, and the freedom to live beyond his shadow. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. In the quiet days that followed, you felt the weight of years finally lift, leaving behind not emptiness but clarity. For so long, you had lived in a house where silence was survival, where love was conditional, where approval was a prize dangled just out of reach. Yet now, standing free of those chains, you saw the truth more clearly than ever. You were never fragile, never broken. You were strong enough to endure, strong enough to rise, strong enough to reclaim the life that had always been yours. Your father, once the architect of control, now sat in the ruins of his own making. His empire of whispers, lies, and manipulation had collapsed under its own weight. And while he was left with the silence of regret, you stepped forward into a future no longer bound by his shadow.